The snow came down so hard that Ophelia Gardner could no longer feel her fingers wrapped around the leather reins, and somewhere in the last mile, her horse had stopped responding to her commands, stumbling forward through drifts that reached past its knees. She had left St. Louis 3 weeks ago with a traveling party of 12, but disease and misfortune had whittled them down until she found herself alone on this God-forsaken trail through Wyoming Territory in January of 1876, with nothing but $20 sewn into her petticoat and a locket containing her mother's photograph. The wind howled like something alive and hungry, tearing at her threadbare cloak, and when her mare finally collapsed beneath her, Ophelia hit the frozen ground so hard that her vision went white at the edges. She tried to stand, but her legs would not cooperate. The horse was breathing in shallow gasps, foam at its mouth turning to ice crystals almost instantly. Ophelia wanted to cry but found she had no tears left, just a strange acceptance settling over her like the snow itself. Nobody would remember her. She had no family waiting anywhere, no friends who knew where she had gone. The teaching position in Sacramento that she had been traveling toward would be filled by someone else, and within a month, it would be as if Ophelia Gardner had never existed at all. The thought hurt worse than the cold. She closed her eyes and let the snow cover her, each flake another small burial shroud. Time stretched and contracted in strange ways. She thought she heard voices but dismissed them as hallucinations, her mind's final kindness before the end. Then rough hands were lifting her, and a voice with a Texas drawl was saying something she could not quite make out. She forced her eyes open and saw a face above her, young and weathered and deeply concerned, with eyes the color of summer grass even in this frozen landscape. "Stay with me now," the man said, and his voice cut through the wind like a promise. "I have got you. You are not dying out here, not today." Ophelia tried to speak, but her lips would not move. The man lifted her as though she weighed nothing, carrying her through the snow toward what looked like a dark shape in the distance. She could feel the heat coming off his body through his heavy coat, and she instinctively pressed closer to it, chasing that warmth like a drowning woman reaching for the surface. Other figures moved around them, other men leading horses, but her focus narrowed to just the one holding her, the one whose heartbeat she could hear through all the layers of fabric between them. "Found her about a quarter-mile out," the man said to someone. "Horse is done for. She does not have frostbite yet, but it is close." They entered a building, and the absence of wind felt like a miracle. Ophelia's vision was still blurry, but she could make out a large room with a fire blazing in a stone hearth. The man set her down carefully on a bench near the flames and began working at the buttons of her cloak with efficient fingers. Another man appeared with blankets and a tin cup of something that steamed. "Get those wet clothes off her, or she will lose her toes," someone said. "I know what to do, Charlie," her rescuer replied, his voice gentle but firm. He looked at Ophelia, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. "Miss, I am going to need to get you out of these frozen things. I will be respectful about it, I promise, but if we do not warm you up proper, you will be in serious trouble." Ophelia managed a small nod. Her pride seemed like a stupid thing to cling to when she could not feel most of her body. The man worked quickly, removing her cloak and then her snow-caked dress, leaving her in her chemise and petticoats. He wrapped her in dry blankets and then held the cup to her lips. The liquid inside was broth, rich and hot, and it burned going down, but in the best possible way. "Slow sips," he cautioned. "Your stomach needs to remember what food is." As sensation began returning to her extremities, Ophelia became aware of the pain. Her feet felt like they were being stabbed with thousands of needles. She gasped, and the man's hand found hers, squeezing carefully. "I know it hurts," he said. "That is a good sign, though. Means the blood is flowing again. Just breathe through it." She focused on his face to distract herself from the pain. He was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 25 or 26. His face was all hard angles and sun-weathered skin, with a few days of stubble along his jaw. His hair was dark brown and curled slightly at the ends where it brushed his collar. But it was his eyes that held her attention, green and earnest and filled with a kindness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. "What is your name?" she managed to croak out. "Fletcher Kane," he said, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Most folks just call me Kane. This here is a way station on the trail to Laramie. You are lucky we came through when we did. Another hour and you would have been buried under snow." "Ophelia," she said. "Ophelia Gardner. Well, Miss Gardner, you gave us quite a scare." He adjusted the blankets around her shoulders. "What in God's name were you doing out there alone?" The question opened a floodgate, and suddenly Ophelia was talking, telling this stranger everything. She told him about her parents dying of cholera 2 years ago, about working as a seamstress in St. Louis barely making enough to eat, about the advertisement she had seen for a teacher needed in California, and how she had spent every penny she had on joining a wagon train west. She told him about the other travelers who had died or turned back, about the guide who had abandoned them outside Fort Kearney, about how she had pressed on alone because going back meant returning to a life of slow starvation and invisibility. "Nobody knows I am out here," she finished, her voice cracking. "If I had died in that snow, nobody would have even known to look for me. I would have just disappeared and the world would have kept turning like I never existed at all." Fletcher's hand tightened around hers. His eyes had darkened as she spoke, and now he leaned forward slightly, his voice low and fierce. "I would have known," he said. "I would have remembered, and I am not the kind of man to forget something important." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Miss Gardner, I know we just met and you have got no reason to trust me, but I am going to make you a promise right here and now. You are not forgotten anymore. With me, you will always be remembered tenderly, for all the days I have got left on this earth." The words hit Ophelia square in the chest, stealing what little breath she had regained. She stared at him, searching his face for signs of mockery or deception, but found only sincerity. This stranger, this cowboy who had pulled her from the snow, was looking at her like she mattered, like her existence meant something. Tears finally came, hot and fast, and she did not try to stop them. Fletcher did not pull away or act uncomfortable. He simply held her hand and let her cry, occasionally using his free hand to brush tears from her cheeks with surprising gentleness. When the storm inside her finally subsided, Ophelia felt hollowed out but somehow lighter, like she had been carrying a weight she had not known was there. "Thank you," she whispered. "Nothing to thank me for," Fletcher said. "Just basic human decency." He stood and went to speak with the other men in the room, leaving Ophelia cocooned in her blankets by the fire. She studied her surroundings properly for the first time. The way station was a single large room with rough timber walls and a few small windows shuttered against the storm. There were 2 other men besides Fletcher, both older and grizzled, sitting at a table playing cards. In the corner was a small area that served as a kitchen, and she could see canned goods stacked on shelves. It was rough and simple, but after hours in the freezing wilderness it looked like paradise. Fletcher returned with more broth and a plate of beans and hardtack. "It is not fancy, but it will stick to your ribs," he said, setting the food down beside her. "Charlie over there is the station keeper. Says the storm should blow itself out by morning, but the trail will not be passable for a few days at least. I cannot pay for the food or shelter, Ophelia admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. I have a little money, but I need it to get to California. Did I ask you for payment? Fletcher's tone was mild, but his eyes flashed. Miss Gardner, you nearly died. I am not going to charge you for the privilege of staying alive. She ate slowly, her stomach protesting the sudden influx of food but her body desperate for the nourishment. Fletcher settled onto the bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him but not so close as to be improper. He stretched his long legs toward the fire and tilted his head back against the wall. So you are a teacher, he said after a while. What do you teach? Reading, writing, arithmetic, Ophelia replied. History and geography when I can. I love it, the teaching. I love watching children's faces when they finally understand something they have been struggling with. It is like watching a light come on behind their eyes. Fletcher smiled. That is a gift. I never had much schooling myself. Learned to read from my mother before she passed, but that is about it. Always wished I could have stayed in school longer. It is never too late to learn, Ophelia said. I could teach you if you wanted, as payment for saving my life. He turned to look at her, something warm and complicated in his expression. I would like that, he said quietly. I would like that very much. They talked deep into the night while the storm raged outside and the other men dozed at their table. Fletcher told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, about losing his parents to Comanche raiders when he was 15, about spending the last decade working cattle drives and odd jobs across the West. He talked about the loneliness of the trail, the way a man could go weeks without a real conversation, how easy it was to feel like you were just drifting through life without leaving a mark. That is why your words hit me so hard, Ophelia admitted. When you said I would always be remembered. I have felt invisible for so long. Even when my parents were alive, I was always the quiet one, the one people overlooked. After they died, it got worse. I could walk through a room and nobody would notice I had been there. Fletcher shifted closer, his shoulder pressing against hers. I notice you, he said. I see you, Ophelia Gardner, and what I see is someone brave and strong and worth knowing, her breath caught. You do not know me. Then let me, he said simply. We are stuck here for a few days anyway. Let me get to know you properly. Ophelia nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She had never felt so seen in her entire life, and it was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. She fell asleep eventually, still wrapped in blankets by the fire. When she woke the next morning, the storm had quieted to a gentle snowfall, and someone had covered her with an additional quilt. Fletcher was asleep on the floor beside the hearth, his coat bunched under his head as a pillow. He had given up a bed to stay near her, she realized, to make sure she was all right through the night. Charlie was making coffee in the kitchen area. He glanced over when Ophelia stirred and nodded at her. You look better than you did last night, he observed. Thought you were a goner for sure when Kane carried you in. I thought I was too, Ophelia admitted. She carefully extracted herself from the blankets and stood, relieved to find that her legs held her weight. Her dress was hanging near the fire, mostly dry. She took it and stepped behind a canvas screen in the corner to change, grateful for the privacy. When she emerged, Fletcher was awake and stretching the stiffness from his muscles. He grinned when he saw her. Look at you, up and moving. You are tougher than you look, Miss Gardner. I had good help, she replied, feeling warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spreading through her chest. They spent the day together while the snow continued falling. Fletcher found an old McGuffey reader on a shelf, and Ophelia used it to work with him on his reading. He was better than he had claimed, able to sound out most words with just a little help, but his writing was shaky. She showed him how to form his letters properly, her hand guiding his across the page, and tried to ignore the way her pulse jumped every time they touched. In the afternoon, when the light was starting to fade, Fletcher convinced her to step outside with him. The world was transformed, every surface covered in pristine white, the air so clear and cold it hurt to breathe. The snow had stopped falling and the sky was trying to clear, patches of pale blue visible between the clouds. "It is beautiful," Ophelia breathed, watching her words form clouds in the freezing air. "It is," Fletcher agreed, but when she glanced at him, she found he was looking at her instead of the landscape. Her cheeks heated despite the cold. They walked a short distance from the station, their boots crunching through the snow. Fletcher pointed out animal tracks, teaching her to identify rabbit and deer and elk. He showed her where a fox had crossed the trail, its prints like tiny flowers in the white expanse. "How do you know so much about tracking?" she asked. "You learn quick when your survival depends on it," he said. "Spent some time living rough after I lost my folks. Had to figure out how to read the land or starve." He paused, his breath misting in the air. "Those were hard years. I was angry at the world, at God, at everything. Did some things I am not proud of." Ophelia waited, sensing he needed to say this. "Got in with some bad men for a while," Fletcher continued, his voice low. "Nothing too terrible, just some rustling and petty theft, but it was heading somewhere dark. Then one day I helped rob a homesteader and I saw his wife crying over their lost cattle, saw his kids who would not have enough to eat that winter because of what we had done, and something broke open inside me." He looked at her, his eyes shadowed with old shame. "I left that night. Spent the next 5 years trying to make up for what I had done. Worked honest jobs, sent money to that family anonymously when I could, tried to be better." "That took courage," Ophelia said softly. "It is easier to keep doing wrong than to change." "Maybe," he kicked at a snowdrift. "But I still think about those kids sometimes. Wonder if they are all right." She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it through their gloves. "You are a good man, Fletcher Kane. The fact that it weighs on you proves that." He looked at their joined hands like he was memorizing the sight. "You make me want to be better still," he said quietly. "You make me want to be the kind of man who deserves to be remembered tenderly." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Ophelia felt like they were standing on the edge of something vast and important, a cliff they could either step back from or leap from together. She met his eyes and saw her own feelings reflected there, wonder and fear and a growing tenderness that terrified her with its intensity. "Fletcher," she started, not sure what she meant to say. He stepped closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Tell me if I am reading this wrong," he said. "Tell me if I need to back away." "You are not wrong," she whispered. He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious that might break. It was Ophelia's first kiss, and it felt like coming home and launching into the sky all at once. She leaned into him, her hands fisting in his coat, and felt him smile against her mouth. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "I know this is fast," he said. "I know we only just met. But Ophelia, I feel like I have been waiting my whole life to find you in that snowstorm." "I feel it too," she admitted. "It does not make sense, but I do." They returned to the station hand in hand, and if Charlie and the other man noticed the change between them, they were polite enough not to comment. That night, Ophelia and Fletcher sat together by the fire again, talking in low voices about everything and nothing. He told her about the ranch he hoped to own someday, about wanting to raise horses and maybe cattle, about building a life that meant something. She told him about her dreams of opening a school, about wanting to help children who had nothing, about creating a place where everyone was seen and valued. "Come with me to Laramie," Fletcher said suddenly. "Forget California. Wyoming needs teachers just as much as anywhere else, and I am heading to Laramie anyway to meet up with the trail boss I work for. We could make a life here." "Fletcher, we have known each other 2 days," Ophelia protested, but her heart was racing with hope. "I know. And if you need more time, I will give it to you. But I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and I do not want to let you walk out of my life just because society says we should wait." He took both her hands in his. "I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I am just asking you to give us a chance. Stay in Laramie for a while. Let me court you proper. And if you decide I am not what you want, I will help you get to California myself." Ophelia searched his face, looking for any sign of insincerity, but found only hope and vulnerability. This man who had saved her life, who had promised she would always be remembered, was offering her something she had never dared to dream of, a future where she was chosen, wanted, loved. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will come to Laramie with you." The joy that lit Fletcher's face was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Ophelia felt safer than she had in years. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other, while the fire crackled and the night deepened outside. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm finally blown out. Charlie declared the trail passable, at least for riders on horseback. Fletcher's horse was a sturdy buckskin gelding that he clearly trusted, and he arranged for Ophelia to ride behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist. She had lost everything in the snowstorm except the clothes on her back and the money in her petticoat, but somehow she could not bring herself to mourn. She felt like she was riding towards something rather than away from it, and that made all the difference. The journey to Laramie took 3 days of hard riding. They stopped at other way stations and small settlements along the trail, and at each one Fletcher made sure Ophelia had what she needed, spending his own money to buy her a proper winter coat and new gloves and a warm hat that made her laugh because it was so large it kept sliding down over her eyes. He never made her feel ashamed of her lack of resources. Just matter-of-factly took care of things the way he might fix a broken wagon wheel or mend a torn saddle. They talked constantly as they rode, Fletcher pointing out landmarks and telling stories about the land they passed through. Ophelia learned that he was 26, just 3 years older than her 23, and that his favorite food was apple pie, and he could not carry a tune to save his life but loved music anyway. She told him about the books she had read, about her favorite students back in St. Louis, about how she had always wanted to see the ocean. "I will take you someday," Fletcher promised. "Once we get settled and save up a bit, we will take a trip to California just to see the Pacific." The casual way he said "we" made Ophelia's heart flutter. She tightened her arms around his waist and pressed her cheek against his back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of him even through layers of wool and leather. On the second night, they stayed at a small ranch where the owner owed Fletcher a favor. The rancher's wife, a kind woman named Margaret, took one look at Ophelia and Fletcher together and insisted on giving them separate rooms with a knowing smile. She loaned Ophelia a nightgown and invited her to take a real bath with hot water and soap, and the luxury of it nearly brought tears to Ophelia's eyes. When she emerged, clean and warm and wearing a borrowed dress because Margaret had insisted on washing Ophelia's travel-stained clothes, she found Fletcher waiting in the hallway. He had bathed too, his hair still damp and curling at the ends, and he was wearing a clean shirt that was probably also borrowed. They stood looking at each other for a long moment. "You are beautiful," Fletcher said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "So are you," Ophelia replied and then laughed at herself. "I mean handsome. You are handsome." He grinned and closed the distance between them, pulling her into a slow, deep kiss that made her toes curl. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. "We should stop," Fletcher said, though he made no move to let her go. "I do not want to disrespect you." "I know," Ophelia said. "I trust you." They stood there holding each other until Margaret called them down for dinner. And even then, Fletcher kept finding excuses to touch her, his hand on the small of her back or reaching for hers under the table. The rancher and his wife exchanged amused glances, but said nothing, just piled their plates high with food and asked polite questions about where they were headed. That night, lying alone in the soft bed Margaret had provided, Ophelia stared at the ceiling and thought about how completely her life had changed in less than a week. She had gone from freezing to death alone and forgotten to being seen and cherished by someone who made her feel like she could do anything. It was overwhelming and perfect and slightly terrifying, but she would not trade it for anything. They reached Laramie on the third day, riding in as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The town was bigger than Ophelia had expected, a sprawling collection of buildings clustered around the railroad tracks that had been laid through a few years earlier. There were saloons and general stores, a bank and a church with a white steeple, houses ranging from tiny shacks to more substantial structures with real glass windows. The streets were muddy with snowmelt and crowded with people going about their business. Fletcher guided his horse toward a modest hotel near the center of town. "I need to check in with my boss, but first let us get you settled," he said. "The Prairie Rose is respectable. Women can stay there without an escort, and Mrs. Chen, who runs it, does not abide any nonsense." The hotel was indeed respectable, a two-story building with a neat front porch and curtains in the windows. Mrs. Chen was a small Chinese woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She looked Fletcher and Ophelia up and down, seeming to assess them in seconds. "You need a room?" she asked in English that carried only a trace of an accent. "For the lady," Fletcher confirmed. "Best you have got, please." "1 week in advance," Mrs. Chen stated, naming a price that made Ophelia wince. It would take most of her remaining money. Fletcher was already pulling out his wallet. 2 weeks, he said, and add any meals she wants to the bill. Fletcher, no, Ophelia protested. "I can pay my own way." "I know you can," he said gently, "but let me do this, please." Mrs. Chen watched this exchange with interest. "He is a good one," she told Ophelia. "You should keep him." Then she took Fletcher's money and handed Ophelia a key. "Room 4, top of the stairs on the left. Clean sheets, hot water brought up twice a day. Any problems, you come tell me." The room was small but clean, with a real bed and a washstand and a window overlooking the street. Fletcher set Ophelia's few belongings down and then stood awkwardly by the door, clearly reluctant to leave. "I will come by tomorrow morning," he said. "I need to find my boss tonight and report in, but then I am free for a few days. I can show you around town, introduce you to people. The school teacher here is getting old, I hear, probably looking for someone to help or take over." "That would be wonderful," Ophelia said. She crossed to him and stood on her toes to kiss his cheek. "Thank you for everything, Fletcher, for saving my life and for bringing me here and for being you." He turned his head and caught her mouth with his, kissing her with a thoroughness that left them both flushed and breathless. "You do not need to thank me," he said when they finally broke apart. "Loving you is the easiest thing I have ever done." The words hung in the air between them. Fletcher looked as surprised as Ophelia felt that he had said them out loud. But he did not take them back, just held her gaze steadily, letting her see the truth of it in his eyes. "I love you too," Ophelia whispered, testing out the words, finding them true. "I know it is too soon and it does not make sense, but I do. I love you, Fletcher Kane." He kissed her again, softer this time, reverent. "Then we will figure out the rest together," he said. "I promise." After he left, Ophelia sat on the bed and pressed her hands to her cheeks, trying to calm her racing heart. She was in love. She was in a new town with almost no money and no prospects, but she was in love with a good man who loved her back, and somehow that made everything else seem manageable. The next morning, Fletcher arrived at the hotel just as Ophelia was finishing breakfast in the small dining room. He looked tired, like he had not slept much, but his face lit up when he saw her. He slid into the chair across from her and stole a piece of her toast, grinning at her mock outrage. "My boss wants to meet you," he said without preamble. "I told him about you last night and he is curious. His name is Walter Morrison, runs the biggest cattle operation in the county. Good man, fair employer." "Why does he want to meet me?" Ophelia asked, nervous. "Because I told him I was serious about you and planning to stick around Laramie instead of following the trail north this spring," Fletcher said. He reached across the table and took her hand. "And because his wife is on the school board and is always looking for educated women to help with the teaching." Hope fluttered in Ophelia's chest. "Really? Really? Come on, finish your breakfast and let us go see them." The Morrison Ranch was about 2 miles outside town, a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by snow-covered pastures where cattle grazed on hay put out for them. The house was large and well-built, with smoke curling from 2 chimneys. Fletcher knocked confidently, and a moment later the door was opened by a woman in her 40s with graying hair and a warm smile. "You must be Miss Gardner," she said immediately. "I am Harriet Morrison. Fletcher has told us so much about you. Come in out of the cold." Inside, the house was warm and comfortable, furnished with obvious care. Walter Morrison was a big man with a booming voice and a handshake that made Ophelia's bones ache, but his eyes were kind. He clapped Fletcher on the shoulder like a favored son and then turned his attention to Ophelia. "So you are a teacher," he said. "What age children have you worked with?" Ophelia explained her experience, trying not to let her nervousness make her stumble over her words. Harriet Morrison listened intently, occasionally asking questions about curriculum and discipline methods. By the time Ophelia finished talking, she felt like she had just been through an examination. "We need you," Harriet declared. "Our current teacher is 70 years old and exhausted. He has been begging us to find help for the last year, but nobody qualified has been interested in coming all the way out here. The job pays $40 a month plus room and board. There is a small cottage next to the schoolhouse that you would have to yourself." Ophelia's head spun. $40 a month was more than she had made in 2 months of sewing in St. Louis. "I accept," she said quickly, before they could change their minds. "When do I start?" "Next Monday," Harriet said with satisfaction. "That gives you a week to settle in and meet Mr. Thompson, the current teacher. He will show you the ropes before he retires next month." Fletcher was grinning so wide Ophelia thought his face might split. After they left the Morrison Ranch, he picked her up and spun her around in the snow, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he was still holding her, his hands on her waist, his eyes shining. "You did it," he said. "You are staying." "I am staying," she agreed, and kissed him right there in the open, not caring who might see. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Fletcher took her to meet Mr. Thompson, a kindly old man who was delighted to have help. The schoolhouse was a single room with benches and a chalkboard, simple but well maintained. The cottage was even smaller, just 2 rooms with a stove and a bed and a table, but it was hers and it was more than Ophelia had dared to hope for. Fletcher helped her move her few possessions from the hotel to the cottage, then spent an afternoon chopping wood for her stove and making sure everything was in good repair. He was handy with tools, she discovered, able to fix the sticky door latch and the window that would not open properly. She watched him work, admiring the competent way he moved, the focus in his expression. "What are you smiling at?" he asked, catching her staring. "You," she admitted. "I like watching you." He crossed to her and pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I like being watched by you," he said. "Makes me feel like I matter." "You do matter," Ophelia said fiercely. "You matter so much, Fletcher." They spent every possible moment together over that week. Fletcher showed her around Laramie, introducing her to shopkeepers and ranchers and the other people who made up the town's community. Everyone seemed to know and like him, and they welcomed Ophelia warmly once they understood she was with Fletcher. She met the banker and the blacksmith, the doctor and the preacher, the women who ran the church social committee. It was overwhelming, but in the best way, this sudden immersion into a community after years of isolation. On Sunday, Fletcher took her to church. They sat together in a pew toward the back, his leg pressed against hers, his hand finding hers during the hymns. The preacher was a young man named Reverend Harris, who gave a sermon about forgiveness and second chances that seemed aimed directly at Ophelia's heart. Afterward, standing outside in the weak winter sunshine, Fletcher introduced her to more people than she could keep track of. "They like you," he said as they walked back toward her cottage. "Everyone I talk to says what a lovely woman you are." "They are being polite," Ophelia said, but she was pleased. "They are being honest," Fletcher corrected. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Ophelia, I need to tell you something." Her stomach clenched with sudden anxiety. "What is it?" "I am not a rich man," he said. "I have saved up a bit over the years, enough to maybe buy some land and start building that ranch I told you about, but it will be hard work and lean times for a while. I cannot offer you an easy life or fancy things." "I do not want easy or fancy," Ophelia interrupted. "I want you. I want a life that means something, with someone who sees me and values me. That is what you give me, Fletcher. That is worth more than all the money in the world." Relief washed over his face. "I was so afraid you would change your mind once you got settled and realized you could do better." "There is no better than you," she said firmly. "You are everything I want." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, his hands cradling her face like she was infinitely precious. When they broke apart, they were both shaking slightly. "Marry me," Fletcher said. "I know it has only been 2 weeks and maybe I am crazy, but I do not want to wait. Marry me, Ophelia. Let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel forgotten or invisible again." Ophelia's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 3 weeks later in the little white church, with Harriet Morrison standing up as Ophelia's witness and Walter Morrison serving as Fletcher's best man. Ophelia wore a simple dress that Harriet had helped her make, pale blue wool with lace at the collar. Fletcher wore his best clothes, his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine. He looked nervous and happy and so handsome that Ophelia's breath caught when she saw him waiting at the altar. Reverend Harris performed the ceremony, speaking about love and commitment and building a life together. When Fletcher slipped a simple gold band onto Ophelia's finger, his hands were shaking. When she did the same for him, she was crying. They spoke their vows clearly, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their days, and when the Reverend finally pronounced them husband and wife, Fletcher kissed her like it was the first and last time all at once. The whole town turned out for the celebration afterward, cramming into the church hall for cake and dancing. Ophelia met so many people that her head spun trying to remember names. The women of the church had organized everything, providing food and music and decorations, insisting that every new bride deserved a proper celebration. Fletcher never left her side, his hand always finding hers, his eyes constantly seeking her out in the crowd. As the sun set and the party showed no signs of stopping, Fletcher leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Can we leave? I want you all to myself." Ophelia nodded eagerly. They slipped out quietly and walked through the darkening streets to the cottage that was now their home. Fletcher had moved his belongings in earlier that week, his clothes hanging next to hers, his razor sitting beside her brush. Small signs that their lives were truly joined now. Inside, Fletcher built up the fire while Ophelia lit candles. Then he turned to her, suddenly shy, and she realized he was nervous. It made her love him even more, this evidence that he cared about doing this right. "I have never," Fletcher admitted. "I mean, I have kissed women before, but I have never, you know." "Neither have I," Ophelia said. She crossed to him and took his hands. "We will figure it out together." They undressed each other slowly, learning the geography of each other's bodies with careful hands and soft murmurs. Fletcher was reverent, treating her like something holy, and Ophelia felt beautiful under his gaze in a way she never had before. When they finally came together, it was awkward and tender and perfect, more about connection than mechanics, about choosing each other completely. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Fletcher's hand stroking lazy patterns on her back. "I love you," he said into the darkness. "I loved you from the moment I pulled you out of that snow, and I will love you until the day I die and probably beyond that." "I love you too," Ophelia whispered back. "You kept your promise, Fletcher. With you, I am remembered tenderly every single day." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Ophelia dreamed of sunshine and open spaces and a future full of possibility. The next months were hard work, but happy. Ophelia threw herself into teaching, loving the children who came to her classroom each day. She had 18 students ranging from age 6 to 14, children of ranchers and shopkeepers and railroad workers. Some were quick learners and some struggled, but she loved them all, remembering what it was to feel invisible and making sure none of them ever felt that way. Fletcher took a job as foreman on the Morrison Ranch, managing the other cowboys and overseeing the cattle. He was good at it, with a natural authority that made men respect and trust him. He worked long hours but always came home to Ophelia at night, no matter how tired he was. They would sit together after dinner, her reading aloud while he worked on his letters, or just talking about their days, learning each other's rhythms and quirks. In May, Fletcher came home with news that made him so excited he could barely get the words out. Walter Morrison was selling a parcel of land on the edge of his property, 300 acres with good water and grazing. The price was fair and Morrison was willing to hold a note for half the cost. It was the chance Fletcher had been waiting for. "We could do it," he said, his eyes shining. "We could start our ranch, Ophelia. It will be tight for a few years, but I know we can make it work." "Then let us do it," Ophelia said without hesitation. She had saved most of her teaching salary, knowing Fletcher was working toward this dream. "I believe in you, I believe in us." They bought the land in June, signing papers in the bank with Walter Morrison as witness. Fletcher immediately started working on building a house, spending his Sundays and any spare time he could find clearing a site and laying foundation stones. Other cowboys helped when they could, and slowly a structure began to take shape, a simple 4-room house that would be all theirs. By autumn, the house was finished enough to move into, though there was still work to be done. Ophelia walked through the empty rooms with tears in her eyes, hardly able to believe this was real. She had a home, a real home that belonged to her and Fletcher, built with their own hands and dreams. They moved in on a crisp October morning, carrying their modest possessions from the cottage to the new house. Fletcher carried Ophelia over the threshold even though she laughed and protested, and then they stood in the middle of the main room holding each other, both overcome with emotion. "We did it," Fletcher said. "We actually did it." "You did it," Ophelia corrected. "This was your dream." "Our dream," he said firmly. "Everything I do is for us, Ophelia, for the life we are building together." That winter they bought their first cattle, just 20 head to start with, using the last of their savings. Fletcher hired one hand to help with the work, a young man named Paul who was eager to learn ranching. They branded the cattle with Fletcher's own design, a simple K that stood for Kane. Every time Ophelia saw that brand, she felt a surge of pride. Teaching continued through the winter. Ophelia had taken over completely from Mr. Thompson, who had retired to live with his daughter in Denver. She loved the work, loved watching her students grow and learn. Several of the older children were reading at advanced levels now, and two of the younger ones who had been struggling were finally starting to understand their numbers. In January, nearly a year after Fletcher had found her dying in the snow, Ophelia realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another month to be sure, then went to see Dr. Richards in town. He confirmed what she had suspected. She was going to have a baby, probably due sometime in late summer. Fletcher's reaction when she told him was everything she had hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing and crying at the same time, then immediately set her down and apologized for possibly jostling the baby. His hand went to her still flat stomach with wonder. "We made this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We made a whole new person." "We did," Ophelia agreed, covering his hand with hers. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Fletcher said. He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I cannot wait to meet this child, to teach them everything I know, to watch you be a mother." He paused. "You are going to be an amazing mother, Ophelia. These kids are lucky to have you." The pregnancy was mostly easy. Ophelia felt tired and nauseated for the first few months, but by spring she was blooming, her energy returning and her belly growing round. She continued teaching through May, then reluctantly handed her class over to a temporary teacher that the school board had hired to finish out the term. She missed the work, but was also grateful for the time to prepare for the baby. Fletcher became even more protective, always worrying about her overdoing things. He would not let her lift anything heavy or work too hard in the garden she had started. Other women in the community rallied around her, bringing by baby clothes and giving advice. Harriet Morrison was particularly helpful, having raised 3 children of her own. She taught Ophelia how to knit baby blankets and shared her mother's recipes for easy meals for after the birth. The baby came on a sweltering August afternoon after a labor that lasted 12 hours. Dr. Richards attended along with Harriet Morrison, who held Ophelia's hand and talked her through the contractions. Fletcher paced outside, not allowed in the room by propriety but clearly desperate to be near her. Ophelia could hear his footsteps back and forth, and somehow the sound was comforting. When the baby finally arrived with a furious wail, Dr. Richards announced, "It is a boy, healthy and strong." Harriet went to get Fletcher while the doctor finished with Ophelia. When Fletcher entered the room, he looked terrified and awed in equal measure. Ophelia was sitting up in bed, exhausted and sweaty, with a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up at him and smiled. "Come meet your son," she said. Fletcher approached slowly, like he was afraid he might break something. When he finally looked down at the baby, his face crumpled and tears streamed down his cheeks. "He is perfect," he whispered. "He is absolutely perfect." "You want to hold him," Ophelia asked. Fletcher nodded, unable to speak. She carefully transferred the baby to his arms and watched as her strong, capable husband transformed into something soft and vulnerable, completely undone by this tiny person they had created. "What should we name him?" Fletcher asked eventually. They had discussed names but never settled on one. Ophelia thought about it, looking at her husband holding their son with such tender care. "What about Thomas? It was my father's name." "Thomas Kane," Fletcher said, testing it out. "I like it. Thomas Arthur Kane, after both our fathers." "Perfect," Ophelia agreed. Thomas was a good baby, fussy but not impossible. He had Fletcher's green eyes and Ophelia's dark hair, and he was equally happy in either parent's arms. Fletcher was a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor with Thomas during the night, never complaining about lost sleep. Watching him with their son made Ophelia fall in love with him all over again. Life settled into a new rhythm. Ophelia did not return to teaching that fall, choosing instead to focus on Thomas and helping Fletcher with the ranch. The cattle were thriving and Fletcher was talking about buying more land, expanding the operation. Money was still tight, but they were making it work, and there was a satisfaction in building something from nothing that made the hard work worthwhile. When Thomas was 6 months old, Ophelia discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was less of a surprise, but no less joyful. Fletcher was delighted at the prospect of expanding their family, though he worried about Ophelia managing 2 small children. "We will figure it out," she assured him. "People have been doing this for thousands of years. We will manage." Their second child, a daughter they named Clara Rose Kane, was born in June of 1878. 2 years and 5 months after Ophelia had nearly frozen to death in the snow. The birth was easier than Thomas's, and Clara came into the world with a head full of red gold hair that had not come from either parent, but must have been inherited from some distant ancestor. With 2 babies, life became chaotic. Ophelia's days were a blur of feedings and naps and laundry. But Fletcher was always there, helping whenever he could, and the community continued to support them. Women would stop by with casseroles or offers to watch the children so Ophelia could rest. Men would help Fletcher with ranch work in exchange for his help on their own land later. It was the kind of mutual support that made frontier life possible. Thomas grew into a curious, energetic toddler who wanted to follow his father everywhere. Fletcher would take him out to check on the cattle, sitting Thomas in front of him on the saddle, teaching him about the land and the animals. Watching them together always made Ophelia's heart squeeze with love. Clara was quieter, more content to sit and observe. She loved being read to, and even as a baby would settle immediately when Ophelia picked up a book. Ophelia started teaching her letters before she was 2, and Clara absorbed information like a sponge. By the time Thomas was 5 and Clara was 3, the ranch was well established. Fletcher had gradually expanded their herd to over 200 head of cattle and had purchased an additional 100 acres. They had built a proper barn and hired 2 full-time hands. Money was still not abundant, but it was no longer a constant source of stress. Ophelia had returned to teaching part-time, taking over the younger students while another teacher handled the older ones. She loved being back in the classroom, though it was harder now with her own children needing her attention. Fletcher's mother would watch Thomas and Clara during school hours, and the arrangement worked well. One evening, after the children were asleep, Ophelia and Fletcher sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the land they had built a life on. Fletcher had his arm around her and she was leaning into his warmth, comfortable and content. "You ever think about that day in the snow?" Fletcher asked quietly. "Sometimes," Ophelia admitted. I think about how close I came to dying, to never having any of this. I think about it all the time, Fletcher said. About how I almost rode past that spot, how I almost missed seeing you. What would my life be like if I had been 5 minutes faster or slower? If the storm had been worse and we could not get to the way station? He tightened his arm around her. It terrifies me, thinking about a world where I never met you. But you did meet me, Ophelia said, tilting her face up to kiss his jaw. You found me and you saved me and you kept your promise. I have never felt forgotten or invisible since that day, Fletcher. Not once. Good, he said fiercely. Because you are the most important person in my world, Ophelia Kane. You and our children. Everything I am, everything I do is to make sure you know how much you are loved. They sat there as the stars came out, holding each other, counting their blessings. The ranch was quiet around them. The cattle settled for the night, the horses dozing in the barn. Inside the house, their children slept safely, unaware of how close they had come to never existing, of the snowstorm and the rescue that had made their lives possible. Life continued its forward march. The ranch prospered and their family grew. 2 years after Clara's birth, Ophelia had another son whom they named James. Then came another daughter, Elizabeth, and finally one more son, Robert. 5 children in total, each one loved and wanted and cherished. Thomas grew up to love ranching as much as his father did, learning everything Fletcher could teach him. Clara proved to be brilliant with numbers and eventually went east to attend a women's college, becoming a teacher like her mother. James became a veterinarian, staying close to home to care for the animals of the county. Elizabeth married a neighboring rancher's son and settled on land adjacent to the Kane Ranch. Robert, the youngest, showed an early talent for drawing and painting, eventually becoming a respected artist whose paintings of Western life were sold all over the country. Fletcher never stopped working hard, but as the children grew older and the ranch became more successful, he was able to slow down a bit. He taught his sons everything about cattle and horses and land management. He taught his daughters to ride and shoot and be strong in a world that often tried to make women small. He and Ophelia taught all their children to read and think and question, to be kind but never weak, to remember where they came from. Ophelia continued teaching for 20 more years, educating hundreds of children in Laramie and the surrounding area. She became known throughout the county as someone who could reach even the most difficult students, who never gave up on a child no matter how much they struggled. She served on the school board and fought for better funding and resources. She helped establish a lending library in town and taught adult education classes in the evenings for those who had never had the chance to learn. As they grew older, Fletcher's hair went silver and the lines around his eyes deepened. Ophelia's dark hair streaked with gray and her hands developed the ache of arthritis, but they were still deeply in love, still choosing each other every day. They would still sit together on the porch in the evenings, his hand finding hers automatically, talking about their day or just enjoying the silence. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party. The whole town seemed to turn out, cramming into the church hall just like they had for the wedding. There was food and music and dancing, and speech after speech about what Fletcher and Ophelia had meant to the community over the years. When it was finally Fletcher's turn to speak, he stood and pulled Ophelia up with him. He looked at her with the same wonder and love he had shown that first day in the snow, like he still could not quite believe his luck in finding her. 25 years ago, he said, his voice carrying through the crowded room, I found this woman freezing to death in a blizzard. I brought her inside and got her warm, and I thought that would be the end of it, just another stranger helped on the trail. But instead it was the beginning of everything. He turned to face Ophelia fully, taking both her hands in his. "You changed my life, Ophelia. You gave me purpose and meaning and a love I did not even know was possible. And I want everyone here to know that I kept my promise. With me, you have always been remembered tenderly, every single day for 25 years, and I plan to keep remembering you tenderly for however many more days God gives us." Ophelia was crying, and half the room was crying with her. She stood on her toes to kiss him, not caring that everyone was watching, and the room erupted in applause. They danced together that night like they were young again, Fletcher spinning her across the floor with surprising grace for a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. Their children danced with them, and their grandchildren, and their friends. It was a celebration not just of their marriage but of the community they had helped build, the lives they had touched. As the years continued to pass, Fletcher began to slow down more noticeably. His knees bothered him, and he tired more easily. He handed more and more of the ranch operations over to Thomas, who ran things with the same careful attention his father had shown. But Fletcher still went out every day to check on the cattle, still insisted on doing at least some of the work himself. Ophelia's arthritis worsened, and she finally had to give up teaching completely at age 67. But she still tutored children in her home, still served on the school board, still wrote letters to her former students who had scattered across the country. Her mind remained sharp even as her body weakened. They were both in their early 70s when Fletcher caught pneumonia during a harsh winter. Dr. Richards did what he could, but Fletcher's lungs were weak from years of breathing dust and cold air, and the infection took hold quickly. Ophelia nursed him day and night, barely sleeping, desperate to will him back to health. Their children gathered, summoned by telegraph when it became clear Fletcher was not going to recover. They took turns sitting with their father, holding his hand, telling him they loved him. Fletcher was lucid most of the time, using what energy he had to speak to each of them, to make sure they knew how proud he was of who they had become. But it was Ophelia he wanted beside him at the end. She lay down carefully next to him in their bed, the same bed they had shared for nearly 50 years, and held his hand while he struggled to breathe. "I am not ready," Fletcher whispered, his voice barely audible. "I do not want to leave you." "I know," Ophelia said, tears streaming down her face. "I do not want you to go either. But it is all right, Fletcher. You can rest now. You have done so much, worked so hard, you have earned your rest." "Did I keep my promise?" he asked, his green eyes searching her face. "Did I remember you tenderly enough?" "Oh, my love," Ophelia said, her voice breaking. "You kept your promise every single day. I have never felt more loved or seen or valued than I have with you. You saved my life in that snowstorm, but you did so much more than that. You gave me a reason to live, a purpose, a family, a home. You gave me everything." Fletcher smiled, that same bright smile that had caught her heart 50 years ago. "I love you, Ophelia Kane. From the first moment to the last, I have loved you." "I love you too," she said. "Always and forever, Fletcher, always." He took one more breath, squeezed her hand one final time, and then was gone. Ophelia held him and cried, surrounded by their children, and felt like part of her soul had been torn away. The funeral was the largest Laramie had ever seen. Fletcher had touched so many lives over the years, had been a mentor and friend to countless people. The church could not hold everyone who came to pay their respects. They buried him on the ranch, on a hill overlooking the land he had loved, with a simple stone that read, "Fletcher Arthur Kane, 1849–1926, beloved husband and father." Ophelia lived for 3 more years after Fletcher's death. She stayed on the ranch, cared for by her children, spending her days in the garden or reading or writing letters. She spoke often about Fletcher, keeping his memory alive through stories. She never seemed sad exactly, just quieter, like she was waiting for something. On a cold January morning in 1929, 53 years almost to the day after Fletcher had found her in the snow, Ophelia died peacefully in her sleep. She was 76 years old. Her children found her with a smile on her face, her hand resting on the empty space beside her where Fletcher should have been. They buried her next to him on the hill, adding to the stone, Ophelia Mary Kane, 1852–1929, beloved wife and mother. With him, she was always remembered tenderly. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, passed down from parent to child, each one adding their own chapter to the story. The original house was preserved and eventually turned into a small museum with photographs and artifacts from Fletcher and Ophelia's life. Their letters to each other, saved carefully by their children, were donated to the State Historical Society, a record of a love that had begun in a snowstorm and lasted beyond death. The town of Laramie grew and changed, but the school that Ophelia had devoted so much of her life to still stood, expanded and modernized but carrying her name. The Kane Ranch was still one of the largest and most successful in the county. And in the church graveyard, 2 stones stood side by side on a windswept hill, marking the resting place of 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. Their story became legend in Laramie, told and retold over the years. The tale of the schoolteacher who nearly froze to death and the cowboy who saved her, who promised she would always be remembered tenderly and kept that promise for 50 years. Young couples would visit their graves, reading the inscriptions, hoping that their own love might prove as strong and lasting. Because in the end, that is what Fletcher and Ophelia's story was really about. Not just survival or chance or even romance, though it had all of those elements. It was about the fundamental human need to be seen, to be valued, to be remembered. It was about how love can transform everything, how one moment of compassion can ripple outward through generations. It was about 2 lonely people who found each other in the wilderness and chose to build something beautiful together. And it was a story with a happy ending, the kind of ending they both deserved. Not perfect or easy or without pain, but full of love and purpose and meaning. A life well lived together, from that first moment in the snow to the last breath they took. A promise made and kept tenderly, faithfully for all their days. The snow still falls in Wyoming every winter, covering the land in white. And sometimes, when the wind is right, people swear they can hear echoes of laughter from the old Kane Ranch, the sound of children playing and a couple dancing in their kitchen, holding each other close. Just memories maybe, or maybe something more. A reminder that some loves are strong enough to leave an imprint on the world, to echo through time, to never truly be forgotten. Fletcher had promised Ophelia she would always be remembered tenderly. And she was, by him, by their children, by their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, by a whole town that had watched their love story unfold. She was remembered in the school that bore her name, in the students whose lives she had changed, in the very fabric of the community she had helped build. And he was remembered too, the cowboy with green eyes and gentle hands, who had seen a woman freezing in the snow and decided she was worth saving, worth keeping, worth loving for the rest of his life. His legacy lived on in the ranch that still operated, in the children he had raised to be strong and kind, in every story told about the man who kept his promises, no matter what. Their great-great-grandchildren still live in Laramie, still work the land that Fletcher and Ophelia had claimed from the wilderness. They know the story by heart, have heard it told at every family gathering, have visited the graves on the hill and traced their fingers over the names carved in stone. They know they come from love, the kind of love that starts with a promise in a snowstorm and lasts through everything that life can throw at it. And when they face their own struggles, their own moments of feeling forgotten or invisible, they remember the story. They remember that one person seeing you, really seeing you, can change everything. They remember that love is a choice made every day, not just once but over and over. They remember that even in the darkest, coldest moments, there is always hope for warmth and connection and tenderness. That is the real legacy of Fletcher and Ophelia Kane. Not just the ranch or the school or the children they raised, but the story itself. The reminder that we all need to be seen, to be valued, to be remembered tenderly. And that sometimes, if we are very lucky, we find someone who will promise us exactly that and spend the rest of their life keeping that promise. The end came for both of them, as it comes for everyone, but their story did not end. It lived on, passed down through generations, a testament to the power of love and compassion and choosing each other against all odds. And somewhere on a windswept hill in Wyoming, two stones stand side by side, marking the place where two people who found each other in a blizzard were laid to rest together. Their promise kept, their love remembered, tender and true until the very end and beyond.